We have to move now. They know
They
we're
mocked
here.
a simple woman on the plane until the captain went pale, asking,
Relax, soldier.
"Any combat
Have a
pilot
seat."
on board?" The military transport aircraft
longer we wait,
hummed
the
steadily
worse it
through the
gets.
night sky.
Are you ready?
The engines
Locked and
producing
loaded.
that cold,
Let's move.
metallic drone unique to machines built for war rather than
Initiate
comfort.
emergency descent
Inside the
immediately.
passenger
We
cabin,
don't have much time.
the lighting was
What is
pale
the
and
nature of the
unforgiving,
emergency?
washing
Just
over
follow the
rows of
protocol,
dark
Captain.
blue seats and
Change
casting
course
long,
immediately.
fractured
I am
shadows across
taking
the
control
aisle.
now.
A cluster
do
of
that. It's
soldiers
restricted
exhausted,
airspace.
loud, and
Get
overflowing
out
with
of
the
my
kind of
cockpit.
arrogance that
Weapon
thrives in
systems
close
are still
quarters
offline.
filled the
We
back
need to
half of the
initiate the
plane.
manual override now.
Their laughter
Negative.
ricocheted
The
off the
primary
thin metal
objective is
walls,
compromised if we deviate.
mixing with the
Hold
steady
position.
vibration of the aircraft,
Pull up. Give me
until the
full
whole
throttle.
cabin felt
Engaging
charged with
emergency
restless
thrusters.
energy.
Hold tight.
Amid that noise sat a young
Warning,
woman,
structural integrity
slouched in one of the
compromised.
middle rows like she didn't belong anywhere near a military flight. Her boots were propped casually against the seat in front of her. A large coffee stain spread across the front of her faded t-shirt, as if someone had dumped a drink on her earlier, and she simply hadn't cared enough to change. Her eyelids rested half-closed, face tilted toward the window, one hand loosely gripping a paper coffee cup that was somehow still upright despite the plane's occasional shudder. To any onlooker, she looked like a civilian who'd wandered in by mistake, messy, out of place, disengaged. To the soldiers watching her, she looked like a perfect target. "Look at that," one of them muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "A civilian who thinks she bought a first-class ticket. Probably some spoiled brat who didn't want to wait for her commercial flight," another chimed in. Their laughter rose sharply, the kind of sound that cuts because it isn't meant to be funny, just cruel. The young woman didn't react. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't sigh, didn't even flick her gaze toward them. Instead, when the aircraft jerked slightly, she simply tilted her wrist with surgical precision, preventing a single drop of coffee from spilling. The motion was so small and controlled that it momentarily silenced the soldier sitting nearest her. Then everything exploded again. Heavy footsteps thundered down the aisle. A stocky sergeant, bald, broad-shouldered, and built like a wall of muscle, stormed toward her with the expression of a man personally offended by someone else's existence. He stopped 2 seats away, chest heaving, veins pulsing in his neck. "Hey, what do you think you're doing on this aircraft?" he barked, voice booming through the cabin. Several soldiers perked up, eager for the show. The woman opened one eye, just barely, and looked at him with the calm detachment of someone who'd already survived far worse than a loud man in a cramped aisle. She lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and let her eyelid drift shut again. It was the kind of indifference that enrages insecure men. "Are you deaf?" the sergeant snapped, stepping closer. "Feet down, sit up straight, and wipe that stain off your shirt. We're not your damn living room." More chuckles spread through the plane. Someone recorded on their phone. Someone else muttered, "Bet she's never even been on a military base." Still, she didn't move. The sergeant reached down to snatch the cup out of her hand, but she rotated her wrist just slightly, avoiding his grab with a smoothness that didn't match her lazy civilian facade. His hand caught nothing but air. The soldiers who saw it frowned. That wasn't luck. That was reflex. A young flight technician sitting across the aisle froze mid-sip of his water. His eyes narrowed at her posture, her breathing, the uncanny steadiness of her movements. He had seen motions like that before, just not from anyone dressed like she was. "Sergeant," he said quietly, but the big man didn't hear. "Oh, so you think you're funny?" the sergeant growled. "You think rules don't apply to you?" The woman finally lowered her cup. Her gaze lifted, slow and level, meeting his eyes with a stillness so absolute that, for a split second, the loud cabin felt silent. There was no fear in her face, no apology, just calculation. Something about that look made the sergeant hesitate. Before he could speak again, the aircraft jolted the abrupt kind of turbulence that sends unsecured items rolling and passengers gripping their armrests. Soldiers cursed. A bag fell from an overhead bin. The sergeant staggered but caught himself, swearing. The woman? She adjusted her body weight perfectly with the motion, as if she had predicted the turbulence a second before it hit. The coffee didn't spill, not a drop. The technician's breath hitched. "That's pilot reflex," he whispered. "Combat pilot reflex." The sergeant was still ranting, but now his voice sounded strangely distant, drowned beneath the low hum of suspicion rising through the cabin. A few soldiers exchanged glances. A few stared. Because suddenly the woman who looked like a nobody didn't look like a nobody at all. and none of them had the faintest idea who they were mocking. The cabin remained noisy for several moments, yet beneath the rolling laughter there was a subtle pressure building, the kind that settles in right before something shifts in a direction no one expects. The young woman still sat in that lazy, half-reclined posture, but every movement she made carried a level of precision that contradicted her messy shirt and relaxed expression. Even the way she steadied the coffee cup seemed instinctive, a motion too clean and too efficient for someone who supposedly didn't belong on a military transport. A soldier leaned across the aisle to whisper that she was probably a clueless civilian hitching a ride she hadn't earned, pretending she understood military travel because she had watched some documentary on the internet. His friend laughed, though there was a faint hesitation in the sound, as if the odd perfection of her earlier wrist movement lingered in his mind with a weight he couldn't explain. The sergeant stood stiffly beside her row, replaying the moment she dodged his grab with unsettling ease, wondering how a passenger who looked so careless could move like someone trained to operate under pressure. Across the aisle, the young flight technician watched her with growing focus, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed small details most people never learned to see. Her shoulders remained level despite the hum of turbulence running through the fuselage, and her breathing stayed steady in a way he recognized from pilots who had logged thousands of hours in combat aircraft. His chest tightened as he realized how closely her physical responses matched those seasoned aviators, the ones trained to counter G-forces and unpredictable jolts with their entire body rather than relying on instinct. The plane jolted again, harder this time, sending muttered curses down the aisle as a few soldiers gripped their armrests. A water bottle rolled across the floor, bumping into boots that lifted too late to avoid the spill. Through the shaking, her reaction was immediate and frighteningly accurate. She leaned into the vibration half a second before the worst of it hit, as if she had read the pattern of turbulence from the engine pitch, rather than waiting to feel it. To the technician, that movement wasn't just familiar, it was unmistakable. The sergeant inhaled sharply, preparing to shout again, but the look she gave him halted the words in his throat. Her eyes, now fully open, held a silent steadiness that didn't show annoyance or fear, but something far more dangerous: assessment. It was the look of someone who had been screamed at by people with much higher rank and much better aim. The kind of person who learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than any argument. Before the tension could ignite, a flight officer stepped into the aisle, his uniform crisp and his stride purposeful, though the tightness in his jaw revealed he wasn't here for routine checks. He scanned the cabin quickly, noticing the cluster of soldiers and the sergeant standing in a posture that suggested conflict more than discipline. His gaze shifted toward the woman, lingering long enough for a flicker of surprise to cross his expression, though he kept his tone professional when he asked what the issue was. The sergeant stumbled through his explanation, insisting she was a disrespectful civilian, ignoring direct orders and disrupting military order. The officer listened carefully, but his focus never left the seated woman, observing every subtle shift in her posture with the quiet calculation of someone trained to read threats long before they materialize. The way she set her coffee cup down, deliberate, aligned, and completely controlled, made something unspoken ripple through his composure, though he masked it beneath a neutral expression. A few soldiers noticed the officer's reaction and exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. The tone of the cabin changed slowly, the earlier humor dissolving into a quiet uncertainty as uncertainty crept into their eyes. The laughter died off, replaced by murmurs that carried none of the confidence from moments earlier, and even the ambient hum of the engines seemed to gain a heavier resonance that pressed against the back of everyone's thoughts. The technician leaned forward slightly, his voice caught somewhere between shock and recognition as the pieces finally connected in a pattern he could no longer ignore. Her balance during turbulence, her reflexes under pressure, to her steadiness under confrontation, everything pointed to a history he had only seen in pilots trained for missions that demanded split-second precision and absolute discipline. He opened his mouth to speak, yet hesitation silenced him as the tension in the cabin drew tighter than the restraints on their seats. It was in that charged quiet that the intercom crackled to life, releasing a sharp burst of static before the captain's voice cut through the cabin with urgent clarity. His tone remained professional, yet the strain beneath it revealed complications in the cockpit no one had anticipated, the kind that left little room for error. Every soldier straightened instinctively, and even the sergeant's rigid stance softened as the captain continued. "We're experiencing a developing situation up front," the captain announced, pausing long enough for the weight of his words to settle across the cabin. If there is any trained combat pilot on board, please report to the cockpit immediately. Silence swept through the aircraft like a wave, erasing every trace of mockery that had filled the cabin minutes earlier. Dozens of eyes turned toward the young woman, who had barely spoken since boarding, yet whose presence now felt impossibly significant. She lifted her gaze, calm and unhurried, meeting the stares of soldiers who suddenly realized they had misjudged her in ways that might soon haunt them. In that single moment, the truth didn't need to be spoken. They all felt it. They had mocked someone far more dangerous and far more essential than they could have ever imagined. The cabin stayed frozen after the captain's announcement, the silence stretching long enough for every soldier aboard to realize something had shifted beyond anything they had expected. The sergeant who had been yelling moments earlier lowered his shoulders uncertainly, his confidence dissolving as the weight of possibility settled over him like an unwelcome truth. Across from him, the flight officer studied the young woman with a focused intensity that made clear he was reassessing everything he had assumed when he first walked down the aisle. The woman remained seated for several seconds, and that stillness unsettled the men watching her, because it carried a controlled clarity that did not match any civilian demeanor they had ever seen. Her breathing stayed even, her posture quietly aligned, and her eyes scanned the cabin with the calm awareness of someone accustomed to making decisions under far more critical conditions. She was not trying to impress anyone, nor was she trying to hide. She simply existed in a steady readiness that felt deeply out of place on a passenger bench. The technician across the aisle recognized the pattern first, because he had witnessed it countless times during pre-flight checks when seasoned combat aviators prepared their bodies for unpredictable motion. The subtle tension in her shoulders, the controlled position of her feet, and the way she anchored her hands on the armrests, all matched behaviors drilled into pilots who understood how quickly environments could turn hostile. His heartbeat quickened as he realized her reactions were not coincidental but refined through thousands of repetitions. The aircraft trembled again, this time with a sharper resonance that rippled across the cabin and forced several soldiers to brace themselves awkwardly. Yet she anticipated the motion half a second before it fully hit, leaning into the developing vibration with practiced instinct that responded to engine pitch rather than physical jolt. That movement confirmed every suspicion forming in the technician's mind, and he stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and recognition, suddenly aware that the cabin might be relying on her skills more than anyone wanted to admit. The flight officer cleared his throat and stepped closer, his voice lower now as he asked whether she had any formal experience piloting military aircraft. It was not a challenge, nor an accusation, but a measured question from someone trained to read subtle indicators of competence when the situation demanded quick judgment. She met his gaze without hesitation, and in her eyes he saw the unmistakable steadiness of someone who carried far more history than her casual appearance suggested. She gave a small shake of her head, yet the movement carried a precision that felt less like denial and more like an effort to avoid reopening a part of her life she had intentionally buried. The officer recognized the nuance immediately, though he stopped himself from pressing further, sensing that the truth would emerge soon enough without confrontation. Before anyone could speak again, the intercom crackled sharply, and the captain's voice returned with a tone that left no room for doubt about the severity of the situation. "We are now dealing with critical flight deviations," the captain said, his controlled breathing barely concealing rising urgency. "If any qualified combat pilot is on board, report to the cockpit immediately. We cannot delay." The words cut through the cabin like a clean strike, removing any lingering embarrassment from the soldiers who had mocked her earlier. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and even the sergeant's posture collapsed into a nervous stiffness as he realized how dependent they might be on someone he had dismissed as a nuisance. The officer straightened instinctively, understanding that every second of hesitation now carried a measurable cost. The woman finally shifted her weight, lowering her feet to the floor in a single deliberate motion that carried the crisp efficiency of training she could no longer conceal. Her posture transformed with a smooth clarity that erased any remaining doubt about the depth of her experience, revealing a readiness that did not require explanation to be understood. She wasn't revealing a secret. She was simply returning to a version of herself she had tried to leave behind. The technician watched every detail with widening eyes, recognizing the exact physical transition he had seen among elite aviators preparing for high-risk maneuvers. Her stance aligned automatically, her breathing adjusted subtly, and her focus narrowed with the kind of tactical awareness found only in pilots trained to respond to emergencies at altitudes where hesitation could be fatal. His breath escaped in a quiet exhale, half reverence and half awe, as he realized the truth they had all missed. The flight officer stepped back to give her space, his expression turning respectful, in a way that carried no hesitation, because he understood the significance of what he was witnessing. Even the sergeant instinctively moved aside, guided not by orders but by a growing awareness that she carried a level of competence he could neither match nor question. The aisle cleared almost immediately, creating a corridor of expectation that formed more from instinct than instruction. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the tension with a quiet authority that felt both steady and absolute. "Take me to the cockpit," she said, each word delivered with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to stepping into control when situations reach their breaking point. The officer nodded immediately, recognizing in her tone the unmistakable cadence of a professional who understood responsibility at its highest stakes. As she rose from her seat, the cabin's atmosphere shifted once more, shedding its earlier arrogance and replacing it with a sober respect none of the soldiers could fully express. They didn't know her name, rank, or past, but they felt her presence settle into the space with a weight that carried unmistakable purpose. And as the aircraft trembled again, every passenger understood that the mockery from earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a single, unspoken realization. The person they had dismissed was the one person they now depended on. The officer guided her toward the front of the aircraft, and the aisle cleared with an instinctive discipline that revealed how completely the mood had shifted since the earlier taunting. Soldiers straightened as she passed, not because she demanded respect, but because something in her posture radiated a quiet command presence they could no longer ignore. Her steps remained steady and deliberate, matching the subtle vibrations running through the fuselage with an ease that indicated deep familiarity with airborne conditions. Another tremor rippled along the cabin, sharper than before, causing several passengers to grip their armrests while loose gear rattled inside overhead compartments. The aircraft's oscillations no longer felt like routine turbulence, but carried the uneven signature of unstable control surfaces reacting unpredictably to pilot inputs. Through each jolt, she adjusted her balance with small but precise shifts, aligning her center of gravity before the aircraft completed its roll, as though she were reading the developing motion from engine pitch rather than reacting afterward. The officer glanced back at her with increasing frequency, sensing the accuracy of her adjustments and recognizing that her reactions were not coincidental. By the time they reached the reinforced cockpit door, his expression had changed from suspicion to quiet certainty, though he hesitated briefly before knocking. He held her gaze for a moment, silently acknowledging that whatever identity she had concealed, her instincts in the aircraft were those of someone far more capable than any passenger listed on the manifest. The cockpit opened after a coded buzz, revealing an environment dominated by dim panel lights and the steady pulse of amber and red warnings scattered across the displays. The cramped space smelled faintly of warm electronics, and the air carried the tension of pilots focused beyond normal workload. The captain sat forward in his seat, manually compensating for erratic responses in the flight control system, while the first officer monitored airspeed, vertical deviation, and irregular attitude drift on the primary flight display. The malfunction indicators were not catastrophic, but they were serious enough to require continuous corrections, and the fatigue on both pilots' faces made clear that the situation had escalated faster than expected. The captain acknowledged the officer with a brief nod, though his attention remained fixed on the unstable readings, and he seemed surprised when the woman stepped into the cockpit with calm, deliberate composure. She didn't ask permission or attempt to take control. Instead, she positioned herself where she could see the main instrumentation without obstructing the pilots. The first officer looked at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, perhaps expecting panic from a civilian entering an unstable cockpit, yet she stood with a steady readiness that suggested she understood the environment better than some flight trainees. Her eyes moved across the primary flight display, navigation screen, and engine panel slowly, methodically, and in a sequence that mirrored the standard scan patterns used by combat aviators during high-stress flight operations. She didn't linger on the colors or alarms. She focused on the numbers and trends, noting which deviations repeated and which ones fluctuated. A sudden lateral swing pulled the aircraft several degrees off its intended bank angle, forcing the first officer to catch the console for support while he recalculated trim compensation. The alarms chimed again, sharper this time, and the captain responded instantly with controlled inputs to stabilize the attitude. The woman reacted even faster than the turbulence, shifting her stance into a braced position an instant before the roll reached its peak, aligning herself with the aircraft's motion in a way that only highly trained pilots were capable of performing reliably. The captain noticed the reaction and gave her a sharper look, the kind reserved for people who reveal competence without announcing themselves. He recognized the fluid adaptation immediately, something he had seen only in aviators who had logged extensive hours in unstable or high-risk flight profiles. The officer standing beside her noticed the same pattern, and the realization settled across his expression with growing clarity. "This isn't standard turbulence," the captain said, forcing the aircraft back toward its intended heading while scanning the secondary flight management display. "We're seeing control divergence and intermittent input lag from the left aileron. It's getting worse." She nodded once, acknowledging the information without surprise, then leaned slightly to observe the attitude indicator again. Her silence wasn't evasive. She was analyzing the problem while allowing the pilots to maintain operational control, and both men recognized the behavior immediately. Her attention shifted to the rate of change indicators for pitch and roll, and her eyes followed their patterns with the practiced familiarity of someone long accustomed to decoding aircraft behavior under pressure. The first officer exchanged a glance with the captain, silently questioning whether they should ask her directly about her training, but another tremor interrupted them, as the aircraft momentarily lost minor altitude before stabilizing. The captain steadied the controls again, though the strain in his shoulders made clear that the situation was becoming more difficult to contain with each passing minute. He finally turned back to her, speaking with a tone that mixed urgency with a measured respect. "Whatever background you have," he said, keeping his eyes on the controls, "you're reading this aircraft like someone who's seen anomalies like these before." She didn't deny it, nor did she confirm anything. Instead, she asked for a concise summary of the anomalies that started before the first intercom announcement. The captain provided a short rundown, listing minor attitude disagreements, inconsistent yaw corrections, and irregular autopilot disengagement sequences. As he spoke, she listened with calm intensity, processing every detail with the quiet efficiency of someone cross-referencing experience rather than guesswork. The cockpit grew noticeably quieter despite the alarms and vibrations, because everyone present sensed the shift in authority, even if she still hadn't claimed any. She stepped slightly closer to the instrument panel, her focus sharpening as she watched the irregular drift in roll indicators and the minor oscillation in the vertical speed tape. She didn't touch anything, she didn't need to. Her understanding of the aircraft's behavior was written clearly in her posture. The captain, the first officer, and the escorting officer all recognized the same truth at the same time. She was not simply reacting like someone familiar with aircraft. She was responding like someone who had once commanded them. And though she still withheld her past, the cockpit no longer questioned who might hold the key to stabilizing the aircraft. They only questioned how long she had been trying to leave that past behind. The cockpit felt tighter as the aircraft pushed through another irregular jolt, the vibrations running through the frame with a deeper resonance that signaled the issue had moved beyond routine instability. The captain kept one hand firm on the yoke while using the other to fine-tune trim, his posture steady but notably strained as he compensated for control responses that refused to stabilize. Beside him, the first officer monitored the navigation display with disciplined focus, tracking altitude drift and lateral deviations that continued to appear in inconsistent, unpredictable intervals. The escorting officer shifted aside to give the woman more space, though his attention never left her, because every movement she made reinforced the growing certainty that her presence in the cockpit was something more than coincidence. She stood calmly, aligning her stance with the aircraft's motion in a way that suggested long familiarity with unstable flight conditions rather than simple passenger intuition. Her breathing remained measured, and her eyes tracked the instruments with a steady, methodical rhythm that carried the unmistakable precision of formal training. Another tremor swept through the aircraft, nudging the nose a few degrees off heading and forcing the first officer to recenter the course with a tight correction. The woman braced a fraction of a second before the aircraft leaned into the motion, adjusting her center of gravity in perfect sync with the developing roll. The captain noticed the anticipatory shift instantly, his eyes narrowing with the recognition that such timing did not belong to a civilian who had stumbled into the cockpit by chance. She stepped slightly closer to the displays, initiating a disciplined scan pattern that every trained aviator learned to execute under pressure. Her eyes moved from the primary flight display to the navigation panel, then to the engine gauges, flight control status indicators, and finally the secondary alerts, never rushing, never repeating, and never losing her place in the sequence. The captain recognized the structure of the scan immediately, because it mirrored the technique used by pilots taught to diagnose system failures in real time, without relying solely on onboard automation. Her steady focus contrasted with the rising tension as the aircraft jerked again, prompting several warning tones to pulse across the panel with an urgency that carried more weight than earlier chimes. The captain responded instinctively, countering a sudden pitch deviation, but the slow return to neutral confirmed that the control surface lag was worsening. The woman watched the response delay with a quiet understanding, observing how the timing difference between input and aircraft reaction stretched by several milliseconds, small enough to miss under normal conditions, but glaringly obvious to anyone trained to detect early signs of mechanical irregularity. The escorting officer exchanged a look with the first officer, silently acknowledging how precisely she read the situation without being told. The first officer cleared his throat, hesitating only a moment before speaking, though the respect in his voice made clear that his earlier doubts were fading quickly. "You're reacting before the aircraft completes the motion," he said, keeping his tone controlled. "That's not something passengers do, and it's not something you pick up without serious flight time." Endoda. She didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to finish her scan cycle before turning her attention back to the attitude indicator, where a slow roll drift repeated with nearly identical timing. Her silence wasn't evasive. It was the stillness of someone prioritizing diagnostics over conversation, the kind of discipline found only in professionals accustomed to environments where seconds mattered more than explanations. The captain noticed the focus and gave her the space to analyze, sensing instinctively that interrupting her now would cost them valuable clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, direct, and stripped of anything unnecessary. "Your left aileron response is showing intermittent lag," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "The pattern doesn't match turbulence or autopilot interference. It's originating from control surface feedback, rather than the flight management system." And both pilots paused, absorbing her statement with a seriousness that carried far more weight than her quiet delivery. The captain glanced at the left side indicators again, replaying the last several corrections in his head and realizing that her assessment matched the inconsistencies he had been fighting to compensate for since the initial altitude drift. He didn't question her reasoning this time. Instead, he adjusted the controls more cautiously, as though acknowledging that her insight had eliminated a layer of uncertainty they could no longer afford. "That's a precise diagnosis," the captain said, keeping his voice low as the aircraft trembled again. "Most pilots wouldn't isolate it that quickly without system readouts." She didn't confirm or deny anything, though the subtle focus in her expression revealed more truth than a verbal admission would have. She shifted her stance again, aligning her weight with the aircraft's minor yaw deviation, and the escorting officer recognized the posture immediately. He had seen that kind of movement during training exercises with elite operators, men and women who understood aircraft motion so well they responded on instinct long before instruments displayed the change. Another jolt disrupted the cockpit, sharper and more abrupt, forcing the first officer to steady himself as he recalculated drift across the navigation screen. The captain gripped the yoke tighter, guiding the aircraft through the sudden dip, while the warning tones resumed their insistent pulse. The woman watched the fluctuation in pitch and roll indicators stabilize briefly, then drop into the same cyclical pattern she had already noted, confirming her suspicion that the malfunction was repeating at fixed intervals rather than developing randomly. Her eyes remained locked on the displays, but her attention stretched deeper than the instruments, as though she were mapping the aircraft's behavior against scenarios she had encountered before, scenarios that belonged to a past she had deliberately avoided discussing. The captain sensed it too, the quiet familiarity in her demeanor, and the first officer saw the same thing when she completed another structured scan with impeccable accuracy. The truth settled over the cockpit without anyone needing to say it aloud. She wasn't analyzing this aircraft like a passenger trying to understand a crisis. She was evaluating it like a pilot trained to survive one. And for the first time since the instability began, the cockpit felt a little less alone, because someone who understood the sky at its worst was finally standing with them. The aircraft lurched again, harder than before, sending a deep vibration through the cockpit that made several unsecured items rattle against metal panels with an urgency no pilot could ignore. The captain braced his forearm against the edge of the console while adjusting trim with controlled precision, though the tension in his jaw made clear the aircraft was resisting his inputs more aggressively with each passing moment. The first officer monitored the navigation display, tracking erratic lateral drift and altitude fluctuations that now appeared in increasingly consistent cycles rather than isolated anomalies. The woman stood a step behind the pilot's seats, keeping a safe distance from the yoke and pedals in a way that showed she understood cockpit safety protocol instinctively. Her stance remained anchored despite the unstable motion, and her eyes tracked the shifting instruments with a methodical calm that resembled a trained aviator executing a tight diagnostic scan. She didn't move her hands or speak prematurely. She simply processed the unfolding conditions with a depth of focus found only in operators accustomed to assessing emergencies under pressure. A sudden burst of lateral motion rolled the aircraft sharply left, forcing the captain to counter with immediate rudder input while the first officer recalculated heading deviation. The woman braced half a second before the motion peaked, her weight shifting in perfect synchronization with the developing turbulence. The captain registered the anticipatory movement, his eyes flicking toward her with a recognition that made him reassess every assumption he had formed since she stepped into the cockpit. The first officer glanced back as well, noting how her reactions aligned precisely with the aircraft's behavior rather than following it, a pattern he had seen only in pilots trained to read subtle changes in airflow and control feedback before instruments displayed them. The escorting officer watched her with mounting certainty, seeing in her posture the same readiness he had observed during airborne training drills with elite personnel. The captain fought through another jolt that pushed the nose downward for a brief moment before stabilizing unevenly, and his breathing tightened as he guided the aircraft back into nominal pitch. He scanned the left side control indicators, frustration rising as they responded a fraction slower than they should have, confirming the problem was spreading deeper into the control feedback loop. The first officer reviewed his own readings, but shook his head, unable to pinpoint the exact source without clearer pattern data. The woman completed another structured scan, moving her eyes from the primary flight display to the navigation map, then to the engine instruments, and finally to the flight control status indicators. Her sequence was crisp, deliberate, and unmistakably professional, following the exact rhythm taught to pilots trained for multi-system assessment during high-stress conditions. She paused, as she noticed a repeating roll drift that lined up with the irregular response timing she had already observed twice before. The captain finally turned toward her, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable urgency. "If you're seeing something we aren't, say it. We're running out of margin here." She didn't respond right away because the aircraft dipped again, this time producing a pitch oscillation that confirmed the anomaly was affecting more than a single surface. She leaned slightly to compensate, adjusting her balance with the kind of instinctive precision that made all three men in the cockpit reassess her presence. When she finally spoke, her tone carried a quiet authority that sounded less like a suggestion and more like a command shaped by experience. "Shift your trim 2 points right," she said evenly. "It'll tighten the response window long enough for you to pull clean secondary data." "How?" The captain hesitated on instinct. Every cockpit demanded chain-of-command clarity, but the specificity in her instruction, paired with the exact timing of her observation, made the decision for him. He made the adjustment quickly, and the effect was immediate. The sluggish roll response tightened slightly, the drift slowed, and the navigation display stabilized long enough for the first officer to capture usable data. The first officer blinked in disbelief, then leaned forward to analyze the updated readings, his pulse quickening as he realized her recommendation had bought them precious seconds of clarity. He turned toward her with a mix of gratitude and shock, though she stayed focused on the instruments, mapping the duration of the stabilization with the trained expectation of someone who knew the window would be temporary. The captain let out a quiet exhale, not relief, but acknowledgement. Her recommendation had been too accurate, too targeted, too familiar to dismiss as luck or intuition. He glanced back at her with a more direct look this time, his voice dropping to a lower register, shaped by rising respect and unavoidable suspicion. "That wasn't an educated guess," he said, keeping his tone controlled despite the growing instability around them. That was a field-grade instruction. Oh. She didn't answer, and she didn't flinch. But the silence that followed was loud enough to confirm more than any spoken admission could have. Another tremor shook the aircraft, pushing the nose slightly upward before the captain corrected it with firm, practiced pressure on the yoke. She adjusted her stance again, aligning her posture with the motion in a way that revealed the reflexes of someone who had braced through far worse conditions at far higher stakes. The escorting officer watched her closely, sensing the truth she was trying not to reveal. The first officer recognized it too, seeing how she tracked the flight instruments with the practiced discipline of someone who had once called the cockpit her operational domain. Even the aircraft seemed to reflect her understanding as the oscillations fell into a pattern she anticipated before either pilot articulated it. In that rising tension, the unspoken truth crystallized in every mind present. She hadn't stepped into the cockpit as a passenger trying to help. She had stepped into it as a pilot who had once lived in skies just like this. And whatever past she was hiding, it was becoming harder and far more dangerous for her to pretend she had left it behind. The aircraft jolted violently, rolling several degrees before the captain hauled it back with a controlled but visibly strained movement that tightened the muscles along his forearms. The cockpit lights trembled with the motion, not flickering from electrical failure but shivering under the sudden shift in airframe stress, a subtle but unnerving reminder that they were pushing the aircraft beyond its comfort limits. The first officer steadied himself against the console, watching the attitude indicator swing erratically before leveling just long enough to confirm the roll deviation was accelerating in frequency. The woman kept her stance anchored behind the pilot's seats, maintaining safe distance from the controls while adjusting her balance with a reflexive precision that didn't belong to any ordinary passenger. Her eyes followed the displays in a clean, structured scan, shifting from the primary flight display to the navigation map, then to the flight control surfaces and engine indicators, each movement crisp and efficient. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, and didn't crowd the cockpit. She simply read the aircraft with the quiet authority of someone who had once lived inside environments exactly like this. Another burst of turbulence pushed the nose downward before the captain caught it with a sharp pitch correction, though the lag between his input and the aircraft's response made him tense as he forced the angle back into acceptable range. The first officer checked the left aileron diagnostics again, frustration rising as the delay stretched longer with each cycle, hinting at mechanical interference deeper than simple control surface fatigue. The escorting officer braced a hand against the bulkhead, but his eyes remained on the woman because her posture had shifted subtly, revealing the bracing technique of someone anticipating rapid altitude fluctuations. She leaned slightly toward the left display stack, careful not to obstruct the pilots as she watched a small but consistent yaw drift repeat for the fourth time. Her expression remained controlled, but the tightening around her eyes suggested recognition, not fear, not surprise, but the cold familiarity of someone identifying a pattern she had hoped never to encounter again. The escorting officer noticed it instantly, and a quiet certainty settled over his features, confirming the suspicion he had been forming since her first corrective instruction. The aircraft lurched again, a sharper roll that forced the captain to apply both rudder and aileron corrections to counteract the unintended bank. The first officer muttered that the lag was worsening, his voice tight as he tracked how the response delay created a staggered oscillation that could easily spiral if left unmanaged. The woman saw it too, and without realizing it, she shifted into a ready stance, shoulders lowered, center of gravity aligned, weight distributed in a way unmistakably trained for unstable flight conditions. The roll deviation settled briefly, and in that narrow window, she recognized the developing pattern fully. The transition from primary lag to cross-surface influence wasn't random. It followed a structure she had once studied under high-stress simulation, the kind reserved for pilots whose missions required them to understand failure modes while maintaining combat maneuvering. She drew a slow breath, and for a moment, she seemed to debate whether to speak at all. But the aircraft didn't give her the choice. A violent jolt forced the captain to react aggressively, his input nearly overcorrecting as the aircraft lagged and then snapped back with a heavier than normal response. The first officer swore under his breath, struggling to stabilize the navigation plot long enough to identify which control cycle was failing first. Her instincts reacted before the displays confirmed it, pushing her voice out before her restraint could stop it. "Shift thrust 2% left and counter with manual rudder input," she said, her tone firm and steady. That'll freeze the roll long enough to isolate the source. Both pilots froze not from doubt, but from the unmistakable precision in her phrasing. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a passenger's observation. It was a directive pulled straight from advanced aerodynamic correction protocols. The captain echoed automatically, his training overriding hesitation. 2% left thrust, manual rudder input copy. He executed the change cleanly, and the aircraft responded almost immediately, its roll deviation tightening into a manageable line that held long enough for the first officer to capture clean data across the control feedback monitors. The first officer exhaled sharply, disbelief flickering across his face as he verified the stabilization. "That bought us time," he said quietly, scanning the updated values with renewed clarity. "I don't know how you saw that coming." He stopped, realizing the answer was already obvious. The escorting officer watched her with the expression of a man recognizing someone he should have identified sooner. The captain glanced back as well, the respect in his eyes shifting into something sharper, something edged with dawning recognition. He didn't ask who she was. The cockpit wasn't stable enough for that discussion. But his silence carried the weight of the question anyway. She kept her focus on the displays, monitoring the temporary stabilization and counting the seconds until the lag resurfaced. Her eyes sharpened when the oscillation began again, faint, subtle, but unmistakably there, and her posture tightened with the kind of readiness she hadn't worn in years. The first officer caught that minute shift and felt the realization settle fully. She wasn't analyzing the aircraft like someone assisting. She was reading it like someone who had flown through instability far worse. The aircraft dipped again, pulling them all back into the crisis, and the captain gripped the yoke with renewed determination. Yet none of them looked at her the same way now, because her precision, restraint, and timing had already spoken the truth more loudly than any admission could. She wasn't stepping into a role she didn't understand. She was stepping back into one she had left behind, and in that moment, the cockpit no longer wondered whether she belonged there. They wondered why she ever left the sky at all. The temporary stabilization collapsed as the aircraft slid back into another uneven roll, its airframe vibrating with a deeper structural flex pulse that told every trained ear the load cycles were beginning to stack dangerously. The captain tightened his grip around the yoke, forcing the pitch indicator back into range as it dipped and then surged with a delay that had grown noticeably worse since the previous correction. The first officer scanned the attitude display with rising urgency, watching the oscillation settle into a tighter pattern that signaled the malfunction was creeping farther into the control chain. The woman executed another clean diagnostic scan, her eyes moving across the primary flight display, navigation plot, thrust indicators, and flight control surfaces with a rhythm that mirrored advanced turbulence assessment protocols. Her posture shifted into a more deliberate brace, maintaining safe clearance from the yoke and pedals while anchoring herself firmly against the shifting motion with the quiet precision of someone who understood unstable cockpits better than she intended to admit. The escorting officer watched her closely, fully recognizing the contained readiness of an operator trained for airborne instability at thresholds most people would never approach. A sharper roll hit, driving the left wing downward before the captain corrected with immediate rudder input, his expression tightening as the aircraft hesitated before responding, a hesitation that suggested the lag was now feeding into a secondary pathway. The first officer leaned forward, tracking the delayed feedback across the left aileron and yaw indicators, and his breath caught when the timing shift aligned with the sequence they had been trying to isolate. The captain noticed it too, and the brief glance he gave the woman carried far more urgency than his voice revealed. The cockpit vibrated continuously now, each tremor reinforcing the sense that the aircraft was approaching the point where response windows would shrink faster than the crew could compensate. The woman absorbed each data point with controlled intensity, identifying a developing pattern in the roll drift and yaw bleed that she recognized from advanced simulation profiles designed to mimic cascading failures in hostile flight environments. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her focus steady, refusing to let emotion pull her away from the cold precision the moment demanded. The captain angled his head toward her again, speaking through clenched concentration as he countered another pitch dip. "If you're operating with information we don't have," he said, keeping his voice low, "we need it now. Whatever training you're drawing from it isn't civilian." She didn't answer. She completed her scan, tracking the thrust imbalance, the timing of the roll oscillation, and the subtle shift in yaw behavior that confirmed the anomaly was transitioning into a more complex failure. Her silence wasn't evasive, it was disciplined, the silence of someone refusing to break focus while the aircraft slid into a danger zone that required every second of clarity she could give. The first officer saw the conflict in her eyes and understood that she wasn't hiding a skill set, she was hiding a past. Another aggressive vibration tore through the cockpit, tilting the aircraft before the captain forced it back into alignment with a heavy correction that strained his entire upper body. The first officer steadied himself on the console, scanning the new data as the oscillation repeated in a faster cycle that nearly overran their input timing. The woman braced again, anticipating the instability with the trained awareness of someone who knew exactly when the aircraft was about to break from controlled motion into uncontrolled drop. She inhaled sharply, and for the first time since she entered the cockpit, her restraint cracked under the weight of pure instinct. "Watch your pitch bleed," she said, her tone clipped and unmistakably tactical. "It'll spike on the next surge and dump faster than your trim can hold." "Oh." The captain blinked, startled by the certainty in her voice, but he didn't doubt her. He nodded once, shifting his focus to the altitude tape just in time to see the exact pattern she predicted. A sudden upward surge followed by an aggressive pitch drop that required immediate counteraction. The first officer confirmed it instantly, adjusting trim and monitoring the bleed-off rate with renewed intensity as the aircraft responded just barely within acceptable range. Another vibration rippled through the airframe, heavier and longer than before, and the cockpit lights trembled again, not from electrical strain but from structural load transfer. The woman finished another scan cycle, noting the thrust differential's influence on the roll drift, and she saw the shift she had been hoping not to find: the onset of aux damping assistance degradation, a pre-failure signal nearly invisible unless you had been trained to detect it. The first officer spoke softly, disbelief mixing with a growing sense of recognition. "Who trained you?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with awe. "You're reading this like someone who's been here before." She kept her eyes on the displays, refusing to answer as she tracked the drift tightening into another unstable rhythm. The captain didn't press her. He saw the tension in her expression, the kind that came from experience rather than fear, and instinct told him that forcing the issue now would only cost them the clarity she was providing. She shifted her weight forward slightly as a new deviation appeared in the yaw line, mapping it against the timing of the previous oscillation, with the precision of someone who had once flown aircraft where instability wasn't an anomaly but an expectation. She recognized the signature instantly, and when she spoke next, her tone carried the authority of someone who had given life-critical directives under far more hostile conditions. "You're about to lose aux damping support," she said, her eyes locked on the status panel. "Shift thrust more aggressively and prepare to correct manually. If you wait for the warning, it's already too late." The captain didn't hesitate this time. "Copy aggressive thrust shift, manual correction on standby." "I be craned." He executed the adjustment with practiced discipline, and the aircraft responded immediately, catching a destabilizing drop that would have plunged them into a far more dangerous cycle. The first officer stared at her in stunned silence as the readings stabilized, even if only temporarily. The escorting officer finally saw the full truth he had been circling since the first tremor. She wasn't helping because she understood aviation. She was helping because she had once commanded skies where instability was the rule, and survival demanded seeing danger before the instruments ever confirmed it. And as the aircraft shuddered again, every man in the cockpit understood that whatever she had walked away from, she had never truly left it behind. A deeper structural resonance pulse moved through the airframe, tightening every vibration in the cockpit and forcing the captain to lock his elbows as the pitch indicator drifted toward the upper edge of its tolerance band. The first officer wiped sweat from his brow while tracking lateral drift numbers that were now jumping out of sequence, no longer following any recognizable correction rhythm. The cockpit had shifted into a heavier silence, not from fear, but from the sharpened awareness that stability windows were shrinking faster than the aircraft could respond. The woman remained steady behind the pilot seats, maintaining disciplined clearance, while tightening her balance before the next pulse fully rolled through the frame. Her scan moved across the displays with quick, controlled precision: primary flight, navigation plot, thrust lines, control feedback data, reading each shift with the accuracy of someone trained to decode early cycle anomalies in unstable environments. She didn't flinch at the roll that followed, instead adjusting her weight a second before the movement peaked, aligning her center of gravity with a practiced instinct that no civilian possessed. A sharp airframe flex kicked through the fuselage, and the first officer grabbed the console to steady himself as the aircraft tilted several degrees left before the captain corrected with a hard rudder input. The captain's breathing tightened, but his hands stayed firm as he waited for the delayed feedback to catch up, watching the sluggish correction behave like a system straining against internal resistance. The first officer tracked the timing carefully, recognizing that the spread between input and response had widened again, an unmistakable pre-LOC signature that no crew wanted to see. The escorting officer watched the woman more than the instruments now, because every shift in her posture matched the movement pattern of someone who had spent years training inside aircraft that operated near aerodynamic limits. She finished another scan and noticed a subtle but consistent micro-thrust drift beginning to form along the left line, tiny fluctuations in thrust balance that preceded asymmetry long before alarms detected it. Her expression hardened slightly, not with fear, but with the quiet recognition of a pattern she wished she didn't remember. The captain risked another glance toward her, his voice low and edged with strain. "You're reading the aircraft before it moves," he said while fighting a developing pitch dip. "That doesn't happen without serious time in unstable flight." She didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the displays, refusing to break concentration while the aircraft slipped deeper into the kind of behavior that punished hesitation. The first officer opened his mouth as if to press further, but a sudden yaw swing forced him to redirect his attention back to the controls, gripping the console tightly as the aircraft drifted toward an unsafe bank angle. The captain countered fast, but the response lag nearly pushed them past the threshold before the system caught up. The woman reacted a fraction earlier than the instruments, her voice cutting through the cockpit with clipped authority before the deviation could stack into something worse. "Hold your left correction and add 2% counter thrust. Do not neutralize yet," she said, her tone steady. "If you level now, you'll trigger a yaw spike." The captain didn't like taking orders from someone he hadn't cleared, but the precision in her timing left no room for debate. His CRM training activated automatically. Left correction held. Counter, thrust 2% copy. He executed the adjustment, and the aircraft settled into a controlled arc that held long enough to catch the yaw spike cleanly before it drifted into an unrecoverable loop. The first officer's eyes widened as the reading stabilized. "No civilian recognizes that pre-spike window," he said, staring at her with disbelief. "That's high-risk flight training." She didn't look at him. She followed the stabilization pattern until it reached its natural decay point, noting how the aircraft began to slide back into a shallow divergence. Her silence wasn't evasive. It was the silence of someone who had learned to separate communication from survival, and the escorting officer recognized the discipline behind it. Another heavy vibration rolled through the structure, longer than before, and the cockpit lights trembled with the load transfer as the aircraft experienced rapid attitude drift. The captain countered immediately, but the strain in his shoulders revealed how much authority he was losing as the feedback lag deepened. The woman braced again and shifted her attention to the thrust lines, just as she saw another micro-deviation, forming small, precise, and unmistakably dangerous when paired with the earlier roll behavior. She exhaled slowly, then spoke with the clipped exactness of someone issuing a directive she knew would matter. "You're about to see asymmetric thrust bleed," she said, watching the timing narrow. "Don't counter early. Wait for the spike. Then push 1.5 right. The captain's head snapped toward her. "How do you know the spike will hit now?" She didn't turn. Didn't hesitate. Didn't break focus. She simply watched the thrust, drift tighten, counted the milliseconds, and answered with the cold, steady certainty of someone who had flown this exact failure progression before. "Because I've flown this sequence," she said quietly, "and the spike always lands here." And the captain held her gaze for a single, heavy second, understanding more in her tone than in the words themselves. Then he echoed the directive with a tight, controlled breath. 1.5 right copy. The spike hit. He pushed, and the aircraft snapped back into partial alignment with a clean, disciplined correction that kept them from crossing into true loss of control. The first officer stared at the stabilized readings in stunned silence. The escorting officer looked at her as though someone had just turned on a light in a room he'd been circling for years. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't helping by intuition. She wasn't lucky. She was preventing an aircraft from entering LOC. something only a handful of pilots in the world had ever trained to manage. And now the cockpit understood that whatever she once was, she hadn't left that world behind as completely as she tried to believe. A heavier structural resonance moved through the aircraft, the vibration carrying a deeper stiffness that signaled the load was shifting faster than the controls could compensate. The captain tightened his grip around the yoke, his forearms visibly straining as he kept the nose inside the narrow pitch band, while fighting a response delay that had worsened with each correction cycle. The first officer leaned closer to his panel, tracking altitude variations that triggered intermittent disagree flags as the sensors struggled to cross-check data under the growing instability. The cockpit had transitioned from tension into the controlled, minimal speech atmosphere that appeared only when trained crews recognized they were approaching the last workable margin before genuine loss of control. The woman stood directly behind the pilot's seats, maintaining strict clearance while adjusting her balance a split second before each vibration peaked, her instincts matching the aircraft's behavior without waiting for the instruments to confirm it. Her scan pattern accelerated, not hastily, but with the prioritization of someone accustomed to identifying early cycle degradation in unstable environments. A sudden roll through the aircraft sharply left, producing a short structural flex pulse that forced both pilots to brace as the captain countered with firm rudder input that still landed late against the aircraft's shifting momentum. The first officer muttered under his breath, managing trim adjustments while noting how the thrust-to-response timing had begun drifting outside its normal pattern, a clear sign that their stabilizing cycle was shortening. Fatigue was setting into his movements now, visible in the way he steadied himself before each new correction. The escorting officer watched the woman more closely than the instruments, recognizing the unmistakable discipline in her stance, a discipline he had only ever seen in elite aviation units trained to handle unstable, high-risk flight conditions. She moved half a step to improve her sightline across the primary displays, her expression tightening not with fear but with recognition as the timing between roll and yaw deviations aligned into a pattern she clearly knew. Another deep shudder traveled through the fuselage, followed by a steep pitch dip that forced the captain to override the autopilot again, his breathing growing heavier as he hauled the nose back toward level flight. The first officer checked a rapidly forming yaw drift, noting how the stabilization window was closing with each cycle, and the anxiety in his voice sharpened when he read off the next set of inconsistent values. The woman finished another rapid scan, her gaze locking on a developing micro-fluctuation along the left thrust line, a subtle early indicator that asymmetric thrust bleed was starting. Her jaw tightened, and she shifted her weight as though preparing for an action she hoped wouldn't become necessary. "Talk to me," the captain said without turning fully, his voice tight as he managed a secondary pitch correction. "Whatever pattern you're reading, we're reaching the end of usable control here." She didn't respond, choosing instead to track how the micro-fluctuation synced with the roll deviation, an unmistakable alignment she recognized from advanced edge failure simulations. Her silence wasn't evasive. It was the silence of someone who knew each second spent, explaining was a second taken away from the only thing that could keep the aircraft inside the recovery envelope. A violent vibration jolted the nose downward again, sending the altitude tape into a rapid drop that made the first officer's hand hover over stabilizer trim before he caught a split-second lag he nearly missed. She saw it immediately. "Do not chase that drop," she said sharply, her voice cutting clean through the cockpit. "Altimeter lag will mislead you. Hold your pitch and ride the bleed." The captain hesitated just long enough to confirm her warning through the instrument trend, then executed the directive with disciplined control. Holding pitch, ignoring the drop copy. The altitude stabilized after a short bleed exactly as she predicted, avoiding the overshoot that would have triggered a nose-down cascade. The first officer looked back at her, disbelief tightening his features. "That timing isn't civilian," he said quietly, gripping the console as another vibration struck. "You're reading this like someone trained for high-risk correction cycles." She didn't acknowledge him. She completed another scan and saw the developing deviation in the right control authority, a slight delay that signaled the captain's increasing fatigue more than the aircraft system. She recognized the combination instantly: narrowing control window, pilot fatigue, and drifting thrust alignment. When the next uneven thrust pulse hit, she responded before either pilot fully caught it. "You're losing right-side authority," she said, her tone sharper than before. Shift 3% left and follow through with manual rudder. Hold it for the stabilization cycle. The captain echoed automatically through CRM protocol. 3% left. Manual rudder follow-through. Holding copy. He executed the correction, and the aircraft responded with a controlled, predictable movement that brought them back into a temporary stability plateau. The first officer stared at the stabilized readings with open disbelief. "No one calls a stabilization cycle that clean without serious training," he said. 6 seconds isn't guesswork. She didn't answer him. Instead, she mapped the short-lived plateau and saw the inevitable decline ahead of them, another degradation sequence waiting to trigger, another correction window shrinking faster than the crew could compensate. Her eyes hardened as she recognized the next approaching pattern, one she had hoped she would never be forced to address again. Another structural resonance pulse hit longer, deeper, unmistakably the start of the cascade sequence she feared most, and in that instant, every man in the cockpit understood she wasn't withholding expertise. She was withholding history. A history that was becoming impossible to hide, right as the aircraft entered the border of the one threshold she never wanted to face again. A sharper structural resonance pushed through the fuselage, the vibration carrying enough force to make the captain brace harder, as he fought to keep the nose inside the narrowing pitch envelope. His hands trembled slightly on the yoke, not from fear but from the accumulated strain of countering delayed control responses that demanded increasingly precise timing. The first officer leaned toward his panel, tracking roll rate fluctuations that no longer followed the predictable correction arcs they had managed earlier in the flight. The woman shifted her stance again, maintaining strict clearance from the controls, while adjusting her balance one beat before the next vibration peaked. Her scan moved faster now, structured, prioritized, and unmistakably tactical, tracking thrust drift, yaw rate divergence, and the shrinking interval between stabilization cycles. The escorting officer watched her posture tighten with a kind of readiness he recognized immediately, the kind reserved for operators trained to function under extreme airborne instability. Another jolt struck, rolling the aircraft left with enough force to rattle the overhead panels, and the captain's correction landed slightly behind the drift, pushing the aircraft into a shallow but dangerous bank. The first officer stepped in with a trim assist, but even that adjustment lagged, revealing how quickly the aircraft was slipping into timing thresholds that were no longer sustainable. The woman saw the sequence unfold, her eyes tightening when she noticed the captain's left forearm shaking a fatigue cue more dangerous than any system alert. The first officer monitored another set of conflicting indicators, his voice tightening as he read the mismatch. "We're losing coordination across the roll and yaw lines," he said, tracking the unstable trend. "The timing gaps are collapsing." She didn't respond. She watched the synchronization degrade, noting how pilot fatigue was beginning to compound the system lag and intersection she had seen before and hoped never to witness again. Another structural pulse hit, sending the attitude indicator into a sharper sway that nearly exceeded safe roll limits before the captain forced it back with a hard, delayed correction. His breathing had grown heavier, and the tremor in his grip was now impossible to ignore. The woman stepped closer, still outside the protected space around the controls, but close enough to obtain a complete, unobstructed view of every primary display. "Your reaction window just dropped to 5 seconds, she said, her tone steady and purely technical. "You're compensating late because the cycle is shortening." The captain didn't deny it. He only exhaled and tightened his grip, acknowledging the truth without looking back. Another vibration struck harder, longer, and the aircraft dipped before leveling in a hesitant, uneven correction. The first officer missed a stabilization cue by half a second, and the woman recognized the early sign of a cascade pattern she had been expecting. The escorting officer caught her expression and understood that she had reached a point she had been resisting since the beginning. The next roll hit fast, sharper than the previous one, and the aircraft banked toward an angle that would have triggered a standard leveling response from any commercial pilot. But leveling under these conditions would have accelerated the yaw rate divergence into a pre-LOC event she had no intention of allowing. Her voice hit the cockpit with crisp urgency, cutting through both the turbulence and the hesitation. "Do not level. Hold the bank and apply manual rudder right now." The captain reacted instinctively, his CRM conditioning overriding every standard recovery instinct. "Holding bank. Manuel, rudder input copy." He executed the correction, and the aircraft settled into a rough but controlled stabilization arc that prevented the roll from escalating into a full divergence. The first officer turned toward her with open disbelief. "That was a millisecond call," he said, steadying himself as the cockpit shook again. "No commercial profile trains that." She didn't answer. She completed another rapid scan, noting how the stabilization plateau was flattening too slowly, and how the captain's response time continued to degrade under fatigue. The next structural pulse confirmed it. The delay between pilot input and aircraft behavior had reached a point where a single mistimed correction would outrun their remaining margin. She took another controlled step forward, not into the pilot's space, not toward the controls, but into a position where she could monitor both pilot panels without obstruction. Her presence alone shifted the cockpit atmosphere, signaling a transition none of them could ignore. The captain fought another dip, but his correction landed late again, his muscles visibly struggling to keep up with the cycle. The first officer tried to offset the lag, but his timing missed a secondary cue that caused the aircraft to drift several feet before stabilizing. The escorting officer finally spoke, his voice low but certain. "He can't maintain this pace, you know that." The first officer glanced at her, desperation rising beneath the surface. "If you have training, we don't," he said. "This is where it matters." She didn't move immediately, didn't respond, didn't reveal anything. She only watched the next fluctuation, tracking how the yaw rate spike aligned with a thrust drift she had been watching develop for over a minute. Her breathing stayed calm, clipped, and disciplined exactly the way she had been trained to breathe when the aircraft entered the pre-failure zone. Another resonance pulse hit long and severe, pushing the aircraft toward a threshold that demanded someone step in before the window closed. And she finally did. Not into a seat, not onto the controls, but into the operational position of someone prepared to manage the next sequence directly, with the posture, focus, and discipline of the pilot she used to be, the one she had never intended to become again. A deeper structural pulse moved through the airframe, tightening every vibration, as the captain fought to keep the nose inside a rapidly collapsing stability envelope. His hands shook slightly on the yoke, the fatigue obvious in the slowed precision of each correction he attempted to force through the delayed control response. The first officer monitored diverging roll rate and yaw rate data, noting how the two lines no longer matched any predictable stabilization pattern they had used earlier in the emergency. The woman stepped forward by a measured half pace, still outside both control arcs, still maintaining FAA standard clearance, while running a rapid scan that mapped each deviation with disciplined, tactical accuracy. Another vibration struck, rolling the aircraft right faster than anticipated, and the captain's counteraction landed nearly one cycle behind the drift. The escorting officer watched her posture shift into the exact readiness he had only ever seen from personnel trained for advanced edge flight operations. "Ma'am," he said quietly, the recognition settling into his expression, "you served under Air Combat Command." She did not respond, did not glance at him, did not break her scan. She only absorbed the data and issued the next directive with cold, operational clarity. "You're losing yaw authority," she said, her voice steady. "Do not level. Hold the drift. When the surge hits, feed controlled rudder and add 2% N1 on engine 1. The captain echoed immediately through CRM protocol. "Holding drift. Rudder on surge. 2% N1 on engine 1 copy." He applied the correction, and the aircraft stabilized into a narrow control window that kept them within manageable limits for a brief but critical moment. The first officer looked at her sharply as the readings aligned. "That's advanced recovery timing," he said, his tone a mix of disbelief and respect. "There's only one community that trains those cycles." She continued scanning the displays, ignoring the comment, tracking a faint pre-spike signature forming along the pitch response chain. Another structural vibration passed through the fuselage, heavier than before, and the captain's correction landed late again, not due to error, but due to physical fatigue accumulating faster than the aircraft could tolerate. She identified the next failure progression before the instruments fully displayed it. "Prepare for a pitch bleed," she said, focused entirely on the altitude and pitch trend. "Altimeter lag will hide it. Let it fall 6 degrees, then apply a short pull with a 0.5% N1 bump on engine 2. The captain acknowledged without hesitation. 6-degree bleed, short pull, 0.5% N1 on engine 2 copy. He matched her timing, and the aircraft moved through the cycle with a precision neither pilot expected at this stage of the degradation. The escorting officer watched her with the expression of a man whose suspicions had finally been confirmed. "You weren't training simulations," he said. "You flew operational instability missions." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes on the flight displays, monitoring the narrowing control window that would dictate their next move. Another resonance rolled through the airframe, sharper and longer, signaling the beginning of a cascade sequence that required intervention beyond what the fatigued captain could deliver alone. The next roll came faster, sharper, and harder, pushing the aircraft toward an angle that would normally trigger a standard leveling response, an action that, in these conditions, would have accelerated the divergence into an unrecoverable roll event. Her voice came out crisp and unhesitating. "Do not level. Hold the bank. Apply manual rudder when the spike hits." The captain echoed immediately. "Holding bank. Manual rudder on spike copy. M." He executed, and the aircraft returned to a narrow but controlled line that kept them inside the recovery envelope. She scanned again, reading the timing of the next deviation with the disciplined calm of someone who had survived this exact sequence under circumstances far less forgiving. "Captain," she said, her tone firm and entirely operational, "we are inside the final correction window. When the roll spikes, maintain bank, feed rudder, and apply 2.N1 differential. There is no margin for hesitation." He steadied his grip, nodded once, and answered with controlled focus. "Ready when you are." And for the first time, she acknowledged what her training had already revealed in every instruction she had given. "I've flown this profile before," she said quietly. "We can hold it." The spike hit, and with her timing guiding each response, the aircraft stayed inside the last workable line of control.